Russian force density, literally how many Russian personnel are along the front line, is, like the Ukrainians, not uniform. There are weaker points, there are softer areas through which the Ukrainians can potentially make progress. But I think there is a question of how easy it is to exploit. The Russian drawback that they have found over the past year is, whilst they can achieve breakthroughs, and we saw near Dobrapilya actually a reasonably significant, if you like, infiltration, it's really difficult to exploit those gaps. And so many of them don't become a breakout. The forces don't mass and then maneuver in sufficient numbers to get behind Ukrainian lines and then pose them real difficulties and force them to have to roll back. Actually, what happened there was that the Ukrainians were able to, if you like, close the gap, isolate the forces, and then hunt them down.
Hello and welcome to Frontline. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we are joined by Matthew Savalrusis, Director of Military Sciences. Matthew, thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
Well, Matthew, the talks are ongoing in Geneva, or may have just ended actually as we're talking. Are we seeing anything come out of these that it suggests a change in the way this war is being fought?
Well, it's genuinely difficult to know how these will go, because a lot of it depends on the extent to which the US position is about reaching some kind of agreement by an arbitrary date, or whether they are reflecting on the actual positions of the countries involved. I start, as ever, somewhat skeptical about the Russian position, because it sounds like they're not willing to compromise on things they know will be incredibly difficult for the Ukrainians. And that's probably because they seem to be counting on being able to sustain their operations for a significant part of 2026, at the very least. At the same time, there is this pressure that still seems to be there from the US on the Ukrainians to be the ones who make the most compromises. And it's true that they are not in a great position at the moment. But I think we need to bear in mind that a lot of this is because there is Russian, if you like, the propaganda, the information campaign that is intended to say Russian success is inevitable, and therefore you, the West, who are backing Ukraine, should cut your losses now. And I think one of the important things to remember is that the Europeans and the US still have agency in the level of support that they provide to Ukraine, as well as how Ukraine uses that support.
Indeed. And Ukraine and Zelenskyy have complained that the US position is unfair at the moment, and there is too much pressure on Ukraine to concede too much territory and more in these talks. Is there anything Europe could be doing then to try and bolster Ukraine's position?
Well, there's a combination of how they provide support and then the volume of support, which are the two big factors. Europe is now providing significantly more as a proportion of overall support, and that is because the US level of both material and we might assume some intelligence is dropping. It's not zero. So what has happened in large part is that the US has stopped donating equipment, but there is still something called the Pearl, which is the prioritized list, which is the US created a facility for European countries to buy American weapons, equipment, and ammunition, and then to give that to Ukraine themselves. The issue is that in many cases that's coming from already existing, if you like, budget limits. So the UK has committed to giving, I can't remember if it's now £3.5 or £4 billion worth of support to Ukraine a year. A lot of that goes on operational spending, but a big proportion is on equipment. So the UK is giving to Ukraine from that, and like other countries might spend money on Pearl. But what hasn't happened yet is that European volume of support hasn't, if you like, nearly doubled in order to compensate for the dropping US support. Then there is the question of what kind of support is being provided. And on that, there are still issues to address in terms of, does the flow of material come in such a way that it isn't trickling in, but it comes in larger more useful amounts? And is it being given to Ukrainian forces with enough time to prepare in terms of training on how they're going to use it? And of course, there is still the question of helping the Ukrainians generate the forces, so their mobilization and recruitment issues, which isn't about raw numbers. It's about preparing those people and then getting them into the front line in a usable way.
And on the US position, we had the Munich Security Conference over the weekend. There seemed to be a perhaps more conciliatory, or at least less divisive position taken by Marco Rubio compared to what JD Vance had been saying this time last year. How do you think the Europeans are going to come out of that conference feeling about US support?
It's difficult to know how they actually feel. I think on the surface, the tone of the US message was different in that Rubio was not as combative and as directly and explicitly critical as JD Vance was. We saw that it wasn't Pete Hegseth, the US Secretary of Defense, or self-styled Secretary of War, who was at the NATO ministerial just beforehand. It was his policy lead, Elbridge Colby, and he gave a message that was, tough love, but that was very much on burden sharing, and actually a message that I think a lot of Europeans would agree with. So the tone and some of the substance is more, if you like, emollient or realistic. But the subtext, and actually some of the explicit parts of what Rubio said, was still this message of Western civilization, of culture clash, of Christian society, which I think a lot of people should be concerned about what that actually means in terms of what the US system wants Europe to focus on. And I think the fact that Rubio then immediately went off to some of the most kind of pro-Russian and critical of the rest of Europe bits, including going to basically prop up Viktor Orban during an election campaign, should be setting alarm bells off at the political level. In terms of military support to Europe, I think the message was a mixed one, that Europe isn't about to be abandoned by the US, but there is a need to reprioritize in terms of their global commitments. And I think a lot of people, again, will agree with that. And in that respect, the change of NATO command status that we saw just before Munich, again, which was a sort of switch round of European countries taking on some of the joint forces commands and the US taking on the maritime command, that represents a reasonable readjustment. But I do think that is all about big picture defense of Europe. On Ukraine and Russia, Europe should be under no illusions that that any hope that the US is going to be taking on more difficult work there is probably unreasonable. Even though we do have the issue of the shadow fleet and the US going after some of those tankers, a lot of that seems to be linked to Venezuela. And I should have said, actually, that is an area where Europe could do more. It could start to more aggressively go after the shadow fleet, particularly those which have falsely flagged their nationality.
And we did see France fining and then releasing one of those shadow tankers earlier this week as well. Is that a mission success? It seems a little bit odd that you would then release the tanker back out to presumably continue its trip.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with the details of that particular case. There is an issue, I imagine, for many countries if they want to take action but do so within legal restrictions. There can be some complexity, but there are some cases here where it is perfectly reasonable to effectively stop the tankers, impound them, and actually begin to disrupt that flow of essentially funding that the Russian state is using to prop itself up, given the phenomenal expenditure it is putting into the war.
And while all of this goes on, quite a long way from Ukraine, what is the actual situation generally across the front in Ukraine? I mean, Russia have, of course, during these negotiations, been trying to put forward this idea that they're advancing and their taking of the Donbass is inevitable. that doesn't really seem to be the realistic reflection of what's going on the ground, does it?
Yeah, there are multiple, if you like, battles going underway. So there are two separate deep strike campaigns that each side is launching against the other. There is still a sort of maritime battle. There is the air battle, which overlaps with what's going on the ground, and then there is the actual progress of ground forces. That latter one has become a much more blurred affair over the past few months, which is that we've had a phase where a lot of people were in trenches and we talked about front lines, the front line of own troops, front line of the enemy troops, and that has become increasingly a zone of contact rather than a front line. And it's not static, but what you have is forces infiltrating behind their adversaries' front positions and trying to then force them out. And for the past year, a lot of that has been Russian activity, trying to infiltrate very small numbers of people past Ukrainian front lines, the Ukrainians sometimes letting them go past so that they don't expose themselves, and then they deal with them with either small, infantry or dug-in forces or drones. And that means that often when we are seeing people drawing lines on a map, what they're talking about is the furthest point of advance, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're controlling the territory behind that. But it also means it's proving increasingly hard to work out how much territory is controlled by one side. So overall, the past year and a bit has been characterized by largely Russian advances. Very slow, tens or hundreds of meters a day, adding up to, maybe a few dozen square miles over the whole front line a day or a week, and Russian progress that has resulted in tens of thousands of casualties. And a good example of that is Pokrovsk, which is this sort of city that was being held. It has taken over a year. It has, broadly speaking, fallen to the Russians now. They control it. But there still appear to be Ukrainian units in it and around it fighting on. So it's not under full control. It's also been depopulated and devastated. And so, to all intents and purposes, lost to the Ukrainians. And that is being echoed up and down the front, which is that the Russians are getting in range of urban centers and smashing them. And the Ukrainians are having to evacuate their citizens, but they're trying to hold the territory. In some cases, it's higher ground, it gives access to other areas, or logistics routes run through it. And what's happening in the Donbass, for example, is a very slow envelopment of the so-called fortress belt, which now has decreasing numbers of civilians in it. But the ground is still important, because if you can hold that, you can deny it to the Russians on the map as part of their negotiations.
And Ukraine's position in these negotiations has always been that Russia is still a long way from making serious strategic gains into the rest of the Donbass that they don't hold at the moment. It's part of the reason why they've been held up on this issue of territory. You talk about that envelopment of the fortress belt. Does that give Russia is there any indication in that gives Russia the strategic advantage they claim they have, that would give them some sort of springboard into the rest of the Donbass? Or is this still just going to be a very grinding, slow offensive?
It's probably, I'm hesitant. It's difficult to extrapolate forwards, because at their rate of progress, even if they sped up, it might take them the rest of this year to capture that territory. But to a certain degree, they have moved away from being purely obsessed with territory so much as inflicting damage and casualties. So I talked about them attacking the cities. They are making it increasingly difficult for Ukraine to be economically viable. The other thing that they have done is establish fire control over some of these areas and where Ukrainian forces are. And that means they can inflict casualties behind the front lines. They can prevent, each side is trying to prevent the other from being able to concentrate its forces, but it also means resupply is increasingly difficult. And of course, the calculation that the Russians are making is they can take casualties more easily than the Ukrainians can. And so the Ukrainian policy of not one step backwards, like not willingly ceding any ground, means that they are committing to taking casualties whilst very, very slowly being forced back. And it does mean that they find it difficult to, if you like, build up their forces for kind of counterattacks. It does mean that they are slowly bleeding out and they have to replace those forces. And that's because what's happened is that the line of contact, as I said, has become a zone of contact. For a lot of the start of 2025, that point of contact was over the Russian positions. And they were the ones that most at risk from strikes behind their positions, from Ukrainian drones reaching in, attacking their forces, preventing them from forming up. And that's why they began to move away from large mechanized assaults and into these very small personnel numbers trying to move through front lines. As the Russians have adapted as part of this constant battle backwards and forwards over electronic warfare and surveillance, they have pushed that contact zone over the center and now increasingly over the Ukrainian positions. And so the Ukrainian advantage in drones and surveillance has been eroded. And now it's the Ukrainians who are having to adapt. Now, there are signs that that is successfully taking place. We've seen this around Zaporizhzhia and, say, Kupiansk, where the Ukrainians have launched small-scale counterattacks and retaken territory, including quite a lot recently. So they are adapting tactics again. That does not yet add up to, if you like, a strategic advantage that is going to change the course of the negotiations. Although, as I said, I'm a bit skeptical whether the Russians are really negotiating in good faith.
And you mentioned some of those areas where limited counteroffensives are going on, being led by the Ukrainians. It's happened the week or following the Russians being banned from the Starlink system. Is that necessarily linked, or is it just a sort of coincidence, correlation?
So it's possible that there is. There's been some excellent research recently, including by CSIS, a US think tank, into Russian communications, and they have pointed out how they have adapted their command and control systems. What's happened is that the Russians, both sides have been using Starlink, the Russians effectively unofficially, and it sounds like the Ukrainians have successfully lobbied to have that access disrupted or even cut off. That has affected them. At the same time, they've been banned from using certain Telegram channels to coordinate, and also Discord, which is an app that sort of gamers might be familiar with in terms of creating chat rooms and places to share information. And all of that taken together just does seem to have disrupted Russian tactical communications. I don't know how long that will last, because I don't know how quickly the Russians will again adapt and either relax those restrictions or use different systems. But it certainly seems to have helped in the short term in some areas, because the Ukrainians are reporting significant Russian confusion. One of the ironies of the war is that we are talking about both a very heavily contested electromagnetic spectrum, lots of jamming, lots of access to each other's communications, and that should essentially drive people towards more use of more secure communication systems, classic military encryption. But what we've seen is incredible diversification of the use of fundamentally commercial systems, many of which have very low encryption levels. A lot of Ukrainian work is done on systems that are not that well protected. And we've seen the same on the Russian side. And on the one hand, that means there's a high risk of penetration. But at the same time, the ease of access and speed of use of those systems, in many cases, sees them each calculate, well, we can move the information around, and by the time the other side has intercepted it and can think about it, it's too late to be useful. But there will, I think we certainly will come back to look at how is modern command and control being actually used, because we have this irony of people using fundamentally very insecure systems to communicate.
And what about some of those counteroffensives we've heard of going on, especially in Zaporizhzhia, the Ukrainians retaking what's claimed to be quite significant portions of land, and yet at the same time there are some saying this might be a matter of where Russian positions really are, and revealing that Russian advances might not have been as far as they were claiming. Are we getting an idea yet of what the position is on the ground in Zaporizhzhia?
I mean, I think it's difficult for us to know, 1,000 miles away, looking at sort of delayed reporting, some of which is obscured. I think there's probably an element to which, yes, some of the advances previously were, the furthest that Russians have been detected, and you look at a lot of the people who are tracking this, and they increasingly make clear there are Russian forces here, but the area behind them is contested rather than actively controlled. There do seem to have been Ukrainian moves to push back. That's important around Zaporizhzhia because, of course, what was happening there was that Zaporizhzhia itself was becoming under fire, was increasingly in range of a variety of different Russian systems, and they can begin to bring that firepower to bear to, again, attack civilian targets and depopulate it. Zaporizhzhia also matters because, of course, the nuclear power plant there is currently under Russian control, and its status under any peace deal is heavily contested and likely to be of interest, given how big a proportion of Ukrainian power is generated by Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and so they have an interest in making sure that that doesn't become another both angle of attack for the Russians, but ideally they would love to be able to push the Russians back and actually regain control so that it's not a factor in the discussions.
And what do some of those retaking of certain sections of land and perhaps counteroffensive tell us about the way the Ukrainians are fighting the Russians? Is there a level of adaptation to what's going on the front?
Well, what's happening is that some of Ukraine's more experienced or better equipped units are finding ways to break into that contact zone and then take a different approach to suppressing Russian surveillance, to countering their ability to observe Ukrainian forces, and then working out how to advance and attack. And that isn't uniform across the line. And in some cases, it depends on different force density. But it shows two things. The first is that it is still possible to maneuver, but it requires a very different approach and a different balance of forces and capabilities to effectively break in. So they have to sequence how they suppress Russian artillery and Russian drone operators. They've got to find them, suppress them, or kill them, or force them back. The other thing it demonstrates is that Russian force density, literally how many Russian personnel are along the front line, is, like the Ukrainians, not uniform. There are weaker points, there are softer areas through which the Ukrainians can potentially make progress. But I think there is a question of how easy it is to exploit. The Russian drawback that they have found over the past year is, whilst they can achieve breakthroughs, and we saw near Dobrapilya actually a reasonably significant, if you like, infiltration, it's really difficult to exploit those gaps. And so many of them don't become a breakout. The forces don't mass and then maneuver in sufficient numbers to get behind Ukrainian lines and then pose them real difficulties and force them to have to roll back. Actually, what happened there was that the Ukrainians were able to, if you like, close the gap, isolate the forces, and then hunt them down. And now that requires the movement of what little reserves the Ukrainians have. And so the Russians are constantly probing and looking for other soft spots. But what Zaporizhzhia and other places have shown is that there are soft spots in the Russian line as well.
And further away from the front in Ukraine, obviously Russia's bombardment of the energy infrastructure in that country is ongoing. There was a fear that could have very severe consequences for Ukraine, and yet the Ukrainians now seem confident they will be able to push through into summer when warmer weather is going to make this less of a pressing issue. Does it look like the Russian campaign will have to wrap up soon, that air campaign?
I mean, I think the question is the volume of attacks and the impact it has. In terms of volume of attacks, the Russians are now able to routinely maintain a level of maybe 150 to 200 drones, on any given day, and they can surge that up 400, 500. I think 800 is the largest. interspersed with a reasonable number of cruise and ballistic missiles to go after the hardest targets. And it looks like the Russians can maintain that kind of low level, which really stresses the Ukrainian system. The challenge that the Ukrainians have is that they appear to be running very low on the sort of the highest end interceptors, things like PAC-3, which is the Patriot interceptor, which is most optimized against high-speed cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. And that's just because they're in short supply globally, and the Americans are the only people who can really provide those, if via countries like Germany. So that overall level of strike continues to come in. The bit that is, if you like, seasonally limited is how much of that goes into the power generation and what impact that has. And it has been a particularly cold winter, sort of minus 20, lower than that in some days. The Russian energy targeting does seem to have caused a lot of damage this winter. They do seem to have focused their effect. It has politically caused significant problems, particularly in Kyiv. You can see a lot of public anger at the Kyiv authorities because they, prosaic stuff like they've not been able to grit or keep ice-free pathways and walkways, and that means there are more people falling over, there are more road accidents, and that's from people who are stuck in freezing conditions, who have to venture out to do their shopping. And so there are compounding effects from the weather, which will ease as it warms up. But I think the challenge is the volume of fire that the Ukrainians have to face. Now, they are responding with a range of different options. So they are, hopefully going to be bringing in more automatic gun systems that can shoot down the Shaheds. The UK has just agreed to provide more interceptor missiles for smaller systems and, if you like, drones that are interceptors, which are sort of really mini propeller-driven missiles, Octopus. There's a genuine question about whether that is anywhere near the volume necessary to deal with thousands of incoming weapons from Russia a week. But so we may be facing sort of the peak of the winter campaign, but the reality is that the Russian long-range strike campaign using different weapons is likely to be an ongoing concern, particularly as those weapons get upgraded.
And just finally, Matthew, we're also hearing that Germany is going to invite Ukraine to train some of its troops. We've spoken a lot about how this war has changed a lot from previous wars. Is there a lot for Europe to learn, do you think, from the Ukrainians at the moment? Or is this war quite unique in the way that both sides are set up to combat each other?
I mean, it's probably a truism to say that all wars are unique, and there are a lot of lessons that we want to be cautious about learning from Russia and Ukraine, because, as NATO would say, we aren't the Ukrainian armed forces. We wouldn't fight the same way. For example, we have a much heavier reliance on, because we have much better air power. But there are a phenomenal number of lessons about how current capabilities are being used that absolutely should be learned. And we've seen reports in the past week about an exercise last year, so a NATO exercise up in Estonia that involved a variety of countries and Ukrainian forces as part of the notional enemy forces. And they apparently had great success using uncrewed systems against the NATO armour. Now, the reporting of that seems to have been wildly overblown and done quite badly in terms of exaggerating the impact. But at the basic heart of it was, just over a year ago, NATO ground forces didn't seem like they had particularly good counter-drone defensive systems of various kinds. And that's probably a combination of the type of system they have and the volume that they have. Bluntly, those kind of systems have always been necessary, but they've gone from being a sort of niche specialist capability to something that armies probably need throughout their forces. And so there's a volume question. There are also lots that NATO forces can learn from the Ukrainians on the tactics that the Russians are using, which will, of course, be adapted if they were facing a NATO adversary. But will certainly be useful in terms of thinking about how Russia might fight. And then there are broad reminders of lessons that we should already have known, which is, if you fight a large industrial war, what is the rate at which you could suffer casualties? What is the rate at which you might use up ammunition? And what do you need to think about in terms of your assumptions about how you can resupply and sustain a fight? And I think lots of European militaries across NATO will be looking at the raw numbers coming out of Ukraine and taking a sharp intake of breath when they compare it to their own holdings of ammunition and their assumptions about the casualties that they might take.
Well, Matthew Saville, Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
It's a pleasure.
If the American people are able to express themselves the way we have been in the past, I think the verdict that we deliver to the Trump regime is going to be absolutely damning. There are a lot of priorities, but one of those is going to be a shift in support for Ukraine. And look, Ukraine is going to be able to hold out. The question isn't, will Ukraine survive or not? It's how many people will die as they maintain their fight for freedom.
Hello and welcome to Frontline. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we are joined by Ken Harbaugh, former US Navy pilot and president of Valor Media Network. Ken, thank you very much for joining me.
Great to be with you, Louis. Great to be back with you. I hope you're recovered from our Greenland trip.
Absolutely, yeah, fresh-faced. I wanted to start today by discussing some of what we heard out of Marco Rubio at the Munich Security Conference. Very different from the US's last appearance at that conference, and a pretty big shift from some of those words by J.D. Vance last year. Do you think this was a more conciliatory tone?
No.
Because it did hit some of those same notes, didn't it?
I think it was an embarrassment, not just for Marco Rubio, but for the United States. It's going to go down as one of those speeches, not only that Marco Rubio wished he hadn't given, but that becomes a stain on America's honor. And I am ashamed every time I see the recaps of it. I haven't watched the whole thing because I don't think I could bear to. But the very notion that armies don't fight for abstract ideas is, I mean, it betrays such a deep ignorance of America's own history. We fought a civil war over an abstract idea. Our Revolutionary War, no offense to our colonial power, was about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was fought over abstract ideas. And to have the U.S. Secretary of State say that's not something armies fight for, representing the United States, it's a betrayal of our history. It betrays a deep ignorance of what human beings actually fight for. And I hope people remember, because that was nothing more than an audition for the U.S. presidency, the nomination in 2028. And it makes you wonder if Marco Rubio is beginning to believe his own BS. The joke in Washington used to be that he was just biding his time. He was the smart one. He knew the real deal. But I'm wondering if he's not drinking his own bathwater at this point.
And what do you make of this argument that Marco certainly stuck to there, and the US have stuck with since Trump has come to power, that Europe kind of isn't paying its way, and that the US needs to retreat from Europe in order to encourage Europe to kind of fund its own militaries more?
I mean, another deeply offensive idea. You and I were in Denmark together. I believe Denmark paid its way. Denmark had a higher ratio of citizens killed than any other nation, on par with the U.S. after we asked for their help. The only time in history that Article 5 of NATO has been invoked, the mutual defense part of the treaty, was when America asked for help after 9/11 and Europe came to America's aid. You have a percentage of GDP spending in European countries now approaching 5% in the case of Denmark and Poland, I believe. Europe is pulling its weight. And in terms of the moral force they bring to fights like the defense of Ukraine, they're more than pulling their weight. America is the one dragging down the cause of freedom, dragging down these abstract ideas that we used to stand for. I think it is a slap in the face to our allies. And it's not just economic, right? It's not just about pushing for higher GDP spending on defense. It's a moral affront to those who came to our aid. We were in Denmark together after I was invited there as an American to observe this behavior of our embassy tearing out flags planted across the street from the embassy on the sidewalk in these public flower boxes, honoring Danes who gave their lives in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the notion that we would disrespect them the way we did, and then follow it up with the Secretary of State dumping on Europe for not pulling its weight, is, another stain on America's honor.
And were you at least glad to see Europe kind of pulling America back to the issue of Ukraine here, rather than the quite feisty discussions we had heard earlier this year about Greenland? I suppose,
but I remember a time not too long ago, I'm not that old, when America was a global leader. And I remember those days fondly. We are now in a position where the height of the Trump regime's ambition is hemispheric dominance, as if that is some kind of flex. The idea that we're going to control the Western hemisphere, the Eastern Pacific, and our side of the Atlantic. We're going to give China the Pacific, and Russia gets you guys. Russia gets Europe. I mean, that is such a withdrawal from the world stage, and it makes the entire world more dangerous. And we haven't even talked about nuclear proliferation, which is at the center of this argument. The U.S. nuclear umbrella used to be reliable. It kept the world from a nuclear war. We are closer to nuclear war now with this lack of confidence in American nuclear security and the deterrence that provides. We're closer to proliferation and an accidental or a regional exchange than we ever have been.
Yes, and there are some doubts about where the US and Russia stand on the START treaty. Russia has said it may well abide by the agreements laid out in that treaty. If the US does, it's not really clear if either side are going to stick to that, is it?
No, it's not clear if either side is going to stick to it. The INF Treaty has already gone up in smoke, and it is those intermediate nuclear forces, those shorter range nuclear weapons, that are probably going to be the flashpoint. It's not going to be an ICBM that starts World War III. It's going to be a tactical nuke. It's going to be India-Pakistan. It's going to be some commander in Russia getting a wild hair and launching an artillery-fired nuclear weapon. I'm more worried about the ICBMs when it comes to like global annihilation, but when it comes to the trigger, it's probably going to be something smaller, but still nuclear.
And while all of that is going on, the US is still pushing ahead with talks with Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine's heading into another round of US-led trilateral talks today in Geneva, Switzerland. What have you made of the talks so far? Are you seeing anything in that could lead to a peace agreement?
Well, you have only one actor in those talks that is operating in good faith, and that's Ukraine. The U.S. is not operating in good faith, or at least it's operating out of a place of deep, deep naivete and ignorance. And Putin is never acting in good faith. And my greatest fear anytime the Trump administration pushes these sides to the negotiating table is, one, there's just an overt sympathy towards Putin and Putinism. But two, the suggestion that Putin will abide any agreement that America forces the Ukrainians into. It's never been true. I mean, you just have to go back to our insistence that they give up nuclear weapons after the fall of the Soviet Union, and that we would protect them if they did. Time and again, Russia has betrayed its promises, and this time is no different. Unless there are rock-hard security guarantees, which I don't trust the Trump administration to provide, any promises that Putin gives are meaningless, especially if they are conditioned on Ukraine giving up parts of Ukraine.
And you mentioned those security guarantees. They're one of the kind of key issues that are holding up some of these talks. The other main issue, and probably the biggest one, is, of course, territory, specifically the Donbass. Is there anything more you think the US or Europe could do to kind of shift the dial in these talks or in this conflict more widely?
Sure. military pressure. Russia is losing 1,000 soldiers a day. The Ukrainians want to get that up to 5,000. That is the only language Putin understands. That is the only thing that will actually force concessions, is military losses on the battlefield. And I think we have abdicated our responsibility as a leader of the free world. Europe, thank goodness, is stepping up, not enough. But if we can help the Ukrainians fight, they will be delivering the only message that Vladimir Putin can hear.
And as we said, the US has been pushing hard to bring about some sort of ceasefire. How are the US efforts thought of, though, by the American people on Ukraine?
Sadly, most Americans at this point have tired of the conflict. It's just a deluge daily of bad news. And that is not something most people who don't feel immediately affected, who are not in it, can sustain. I'm able to, because I have friends in Ukraine, but most Americans don't have friends in Ukraine. Most Americans don't feel like they have a vested interest. It is incumbent upon us as the fourth estate to communicate, me as an American podcaster, to communicate to my fellow citizens that this is our fight, that if Ukraine falls, then the Baltics are next, then a NATO ally could very well be next. And that has immediate implications for our safety and security and economic well-being. I think if Americans understood that, they would pick the right side, because even though the Trump regime has its Putin-esque sympathies, the American people do not. Even the vast majority of Republicans are at least wise to the fact that Putin's the bad guy and Zelensky's, if not the good guy in the Republican context, he's no Putin. On balance, the overwhelming majority of Americans side with Ukraine over Russia. But if we can communicate the stakes for America, for America's national security, for our economic well-being, I think we can begin to see that reinvestment of the American people, our interest in the fight that Ukraine is waging for its freedom.
And you mentioned some of those Republicans that back Ukraine still and don't feel any sort of sympathy towards Russia. Lindsey Graham was speaking only in the last few days. He said that he doesn't believe Russia is particularly serious about peace talks. He called for more sanctions, more support for Ukraine. We've also got to think about the upcoming midterms as well. Is there a chance that if there is something of a political electoral shift in the US, we could see less of a hardline view on Ukraine coming out of America and the White House?
You mean less of a hardline view to push Ukraine into concessions?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I think we are on the verge of a realignment, which is, I guess, the political scientist term for a seismic shift in how the electorate thinks and behaves. The midterms are going to see a tsunami that is going to wash over the Republican Party and dramatically weaken the Trump regime if the elections are free and fair. That is a serious concern at this point, given the threats being made by the administration. You have the threats to nationalize elections. You have raids by the head of America's intelligence service, who was literally present at a county election office, confiscating voting records. And you have threats to deploy ICE, a regime protection force, around polling places. So these concerns about a free and fair election are very real and very legitimate as we approach November of 2026. But if the American people are able to express themselves the way we have been in the past, I think the verdict that we deliver to the Trump regime is going to be absolutely damning. There are a lot of priorities, but one of those is going to be a shift in support for Ukraine. And look, Ukraine is going to be able to hold out. The question isn't, will Ukraine survive or not? It's how many people will die as they maintain their fight for freedom. And in 3 years, again, if we have free and fair elections, we'll have a Democratic president, a Democratic House and Senate, and for the first time in my life, a Democratic Party that is hawkish, which used to be a bad word, but when it comes to taking on Putin and Russia, a hawkish Democratic Party is going to flip the tables in Europe, is going to really change the geopolitical calculus of our enemies around the world. And I mean our ideological enemies, the ones who whose abstract ideas are antithetical to ours, who don't believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I am looking forward to that day when the Democratic Party reignites that American beacon of freedom for the world, which is, I would argue, dimmed if not extinguished at this point.
And just coming back to the front lines of this conflict in Ukraine, these talks that are going on have been preceded by massive Russian strikes on Ukrainian cities, up to nearly 400 drones launched by Russia last night. How different is the sort of air warfare that goes on in Ukraine to the sort of things that Western armies have become accustomed to in the last kind of 50 years?
Well, when I brief people in this country about my experience in Ukraine and my analysis of what's going on, the opening and the closing of every argument is if America fights its next war the way it is thinking about warfare today, we'll lose. If America went to war right now with China, we would lose because we are not learning the lessons of Ukraine. I just read that the German army has asked the Ukrainians to come teach them how to fight. In NATO exercises where they have brought in Ukrainian drone units, the NATO armies have been getting spanked because the Ukrainians have invented the new era of warfare, not just defensively. I mean, they're knocking down 92% of these drones. The reason Ukrainian energy infrastructure is getting hit so bad is just a question of numbers. The Russians are sending, in some cases, 700, 800, 900 drones or missiles a night. And if a few percent of them get through, it's devastating. But they're still getting a huge percentage of these attacks that are coming through. Meanwhile, when half a dozen drones from Russia penetrate Poland's airspace or a Baltic nation's airspace, the answer is to scramble a bunch of fighters, spend millions of bucks knocking down 7 drones and claiming it a victory. I mean, if Ukraine had to do that, it would be obliterated. It has figured out how to do it efficiently on the cheap. And we haven't even mentioned the drone war at the front, which is, it's not about these large Shaheds with 300 or 500 kg payloads in some cases. It's not about the Kinshals, the cruise missiles. You're talking about tiny little first-person view FPV drones that cost less than an artillery shell. I mean, that's the amazing thing to realize about this new evolution of warfare, that the most efficient weapon system for inflicting mass casualties for over 100 years, the artillery piece, has been all but supplanted by, and the thing about artillery is it's cheap and it's low tech and it's easy to manufacture at scale. We're building something that's even cheaper and super high tech and even easier to build at scale. And it's killing more people now. And that shift has happened in a few years.
And it is worth noting as well that these long-range drone strikes go both ways. Ukraine also fired hundreds of drones into Russia and Russian-occupied territory last night. Another Russian oil terminal was set alight. What importance should we place on those strikes on Russia's oil export capability?
Well, I think the most important thing to note is that Ukraine is attacking Russia's ability to make war. Ukraine is attacking legitimate targets. Russia is attacking Ukrainian civilians. Russia is attacking preschools and playgrounds and hospitals. And if there's still any doubt as to who the good guy is, just consider that fact. The other reason that Russia has to resort to attacking Ukrainian cities and using its military as a weapon of terror is that it is not making progress on the front. It is not gaining the territory that it needs to. And as an act of desperation or frustration, I don't presume to be able to get inside Putin's mind, but he is launching attacks on Ukrainian cities because his progress at the front has ground to a halt, which tells me that with the adequate resources that we're advocating for, Ukraine can win this thing. And they certainly have the will. They will fight to the last man because they know what happens when Russia rolls in. Bucha happens. I've been to Bucha, and Ukrainians will not abide that, regardless of what America tries to force them to do.
And in fact, reports today suggest there are a series of smaller counteroffensives. This is not something that could lead to a larger strategic breakthrough, perhaps. But there are smaller counteroffensives underway in Ukraine following Russia's ban from the Starlink system. In fact, some of these gains may well be Russia admitting it was exaggerating its own advances in places like Zaporizhzhia, the oblast there. But how bad for Russia, or any army for that matter, is the loss of a kind of key communication system like this?
I mean, communications is the backbone. Well, they say logistics is the backbone of any army, but communications is how it all happens. Communications is essential for offense, defense, for logistics, for everything. I think the fact that so much rides on Starlink, a privately operated and controlled system, it gives me a lot of concern. The fact that early in the war, a single person with no government mandate from the U.S., Elon Musk, not elected, not appointed, not Senate confirmed, no statutory obligation to the safety and security of the United States, could unilaterally turn off Starlink because he didn't want the Ukrainians to destroy too much of the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. That is very concerning. I think it should be concerning for Europe as well. I'm grateful that he's had a change of heart, I guess, or who knows. Again, not going to presume to get into his mind as I wouldn't presume to get into Putin's, but he's an ephemeral character, right? And I don't know if Putin pissed him off this week or what, but I'm glad that they are helping. But the fact that it is so unreliable, at some points it's capricious, it's not how we want to operate a 21st century military, at least in the U.S.
Well, Ken Harbaugh, former US Navy pilot and president of Valor Media Network, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thanks, Louis. Great to be with you.
Hello and welcome to another Frontline recap. I'm Philip Ingram. Now, as you can see, we're on our own channel. So please like, subscribe, pass it around. We haven't got our membership set up yet. The technical guys are onto it from what I've been told, but we do pick up your comments and everything else. Of course, I'm Philip Ingram. I am a former senior British military intelligence officer, and I commentate globally on all matters defence, security, cyber, terrorism and anything else. But more importantly for you, I present Frontline as well. So I'm going to point you at a couple of things that set the flavour for what's been happening this week before I get into a couple of the interviews that have gone on. As ever, I commend all of our long-form interviews to you because Ukraine seems to be slipping off the headlines, and this will give you a good understanding of what is really going on, and there's an awful lot still happening. The first little clip I want to point you at is President Zelenskyy giving a statement, and have a look at this here.
As for the elections, an intention to announce them on the 24th of February, this is the first I've heard of it. I probably heard it for the first time from the Financial Times. We will proceed with the elections when all the necessary security guarantees are in place. Thirdly, I've always said that the issue of elections is raised by Ukraine's partners. Ukraine itself has never raised it, but we are certainly ready for elections. I've said that it is very simple to achieve this. Establish a ceasefire, and there will be elections. In other words, it's a matter of security. But if we raise the issue of a referendum, as I have already said, there should be an understanding that there will be a ceasefire for this, because a referendum is structured like an election. That is, security is needed. I cannot go to Moscow for negotiations with Putin, the capital of the country that is the aggressor in this war. We are ready to support the proposals of the United States of America to meet in any territory of America, Europe, neutral countries, any state except the Russian Federation and Belarus. In my opinion, both America and Europe should work together, solely with Ukraine, because it is our issues that are being raised. And fighting Russia alone, with America communicating separately with Russia and Europe communicating separately, I believe that only Russia will benefit from this. Together, America and Europe are definitely stronger. Do I think this war can end? Look, it depends not only on Ukraine but also on America, which must pressure Russia. Sorry for saying must, but there is no other way. It must put pressure on Russia if there is a desire not only on the Ukrainian side but also on the part of the aggressor. Then we will be able to end the hostilities by summer. Today I had a conversation with Emmanuel Macron. We discussed the details of our meetings in Abu Dhabi with the Russians, as well as with the American side. He briefed me on his advisor, Emmanuel Bon's meeting in Russia.
And this is where Zelenskyy says there's no plan for elections or referenda until a ceasefire. And this is putting into context something that had come out in social media to say that President Zelenskyy was looking for a way to get round the Ukrainian constitution, which bans elections during martial law. So that he could go to Donald Trump and say, we're getting an election out. It was mooted that it would happen on the 24th of February. That is a very tight timeline. But Zelenskyy has come out, or President Zelenskyy has come out and clarified that that's not going to happen and tied a lot of it into security guarantees, which again haven't been properly defined and everything else. So elections, he can say he's got plans in place for those to Donald Trump. It was a condition that Donald Trump was trying to force onto him. The Ukrainian constitution still doesn't allow elections to happen while martial law is happening. It would be a real challenge for that to go on. But it's Zelenskyy showing cooperation and the desire to move forward and not put any blocks in place to peace. So the next clip I want to point you at is from the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. Let's have a look at this here.
Besides that they made a proposal regarding Ukraine, and we were ready to accept it, and now they are not. You do not see any bright future in the economic sphere either. The Americans want to take control of all the routes for providing the world's leading countries and all continents with energy resources, while remaining open, just like India, China, Indonesia and Brazil, to cooperation with all countries, including a major power such as the United States. We are in a situation where the Americans themselves are creating artificial obstacles along this path. We are simply forced to seek additional protected ways to develop our financial, economic, logistical and other projects with the BRICS countries. We are told that the Ukraine problem should be resolved. In Anchorage, we accepted the US proposal. If we approach it like a man, it means that they proposed it and we agreed. So the problem must be resolved. President Putin has said on many occasions that it is not important for Russia what Ukraine and Europe are going to say. We can clearly see the primitive Russophobia of most regimes in the European Union, with rare exceptions. The US position was important to us.
And this is where Lavrov, interestingly, is starting to turn on the United States in a way that he's saying there's no bright economic future for working with the United States. And he goes on to argue that Russia now needs to increase its relationship with BRICS. And BRICS is an economic power bloc that was set up to try and rival not just the EU but the US dominance, US dollar dominance across the world. But Lavrov coming out with statements that the United States and Donald Trump may take as something of a bit of a threat, especially when it comes to economic issues. That's not going to go down well in Washington. So we haven't had Washington's response to this yet. We've got the Munich Security Conference starting tomorrow. So let's see what the US response to that is after the NATO conference today with NATO foreign ministers. Let's see if anything comes out of that. But could this be a sea change where the Russians are suddenly recognizing that the United States is not their friend? And could this change the tide of things? Too early to tell. Three interviews I want to point you out this week very quickly. First one is with an old friend of the show, Scott Lucas, Professor Scott Lucas, and he's discussing exactly what Sergei Lavrov said in his comments there, and saying that the US is going back on its promises made in Alaska. Have a little look at this here.
Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, this morning, because he threw a bit of a tantrum. Old Sergei gets out there, and far from saying we're closing in on a deal, he says the Trump administration is retreating on us. They're stepping out on what we agreed. Now let's decode that coming out of the trilateral talks. Lavrov and the Kremlin keep referring back to Anchorage. That is back in August 2025 when Putin gets to Trump face to face and he's going to try to manipulate him. What's he going to try to manipulate him with? The idea is Russians get all of Donetsk, no security guarantees for Ukraine. Well, why should America buy into that? Because Russia is going to tell the Americans, and we're going to get all these joint economic projects. Everybody's going to win-win. You're a businessman, Mr. Trump. We're business people. We're all going to get rich together. So the Russians, as we go through this two-sided trilateral talks, are continuing to try to manipulate Trump and his envoys, son-in-law Jared Kushner, real estate developer Steve Witkoff, with the idea of, look at all these economic projects. Zelenskyy calls them out a few days ago and says, we understand that Russia is trying to discuss $12 trillion, that's with a T, $12 trillion of economic projects with the U.S. Rare earth minerals, you can assume, is going to be part of that. Other investment, other manufacturing deals. Lavrov comes out today, and the indication here is the Americans did not honor what they said in Alaska. In other words, the Russians have not gotten in advance on those economic projects as the lever to get what they want out of the negotiations. So, if Lavrov's in a bad mood, it don't bode well for the Kremlin actually wanting to move forward on this. And it's important to note that although Ukraine said, all right, the next set of talks could be in the United States, and they dangled it out there, absolutely no indication from Russia about a third set of talks going forward. So no, we shift back to where we are, which is Russian missile and drone strikes on a nightly basis. They hit Kharkiv and Odessa and Kyiv overnight, killed at least 3 people, hit a bit of energy infrastructure. Meanwhile, they keep trying to make some type of gradual advance on the front lines. Broad framework, Louis, it's not the talks we're talking about here. It's how much of a window Russia has for that type of military assault on the air and on the ground. That determines what happens next. Putin's biggest hope right now is that he gets Donetsk and he gets a weakened Ukraine through negotiations, or rather capitulation. So we bring it back around to the talks, which is the Kremlin's aim here is they thought they had the Americans in their pocket in late October because Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, real estate developer Steve Witkoff, worked with Kirill Dmitriev, Vladimir Putin's top economic advisor, on that 28-point ultimatum. They thought they had it, but Ukraine and Russia pushed back to the point where the U.S. had joined security guarantees for Ukraine. Whether or not they fulfill them, we'll see. But they've joined that, and Russia still doesn't have a guarantee they get Donetsk. That's why Lavrov was so grumpy today. That their play here is to get Ukraine's capitulation at the table because they cannot get it now on the front line. And unless there's a breakthrough, an unexpected breakthrough on that front line, that's the position they're going to be facing going into the spring and summer.
And Scott then goes on to talk about the sanctions that have come in against Lukoil and Rosenfeld are unfair. And these are the additional sanctions that have been put on against oil and gas. What's clear from the whole interview, and Scott's got a good understanding of this, is the real pressure that these sanctions are putting on Russia's ability to continue to fund this war. And that is something that Putin, I think, is beginning to get concerned about. We're not at the point of Russian economic collapse yet, but there are little shoots, green shoots of woes coming to the Russian people and coming to the Russian economy. Most of the Russian rainy day funds have been expended in supporting the war. in one way or the other. Many Russian industries can't afford to pay their workforces. In the Russian newspapers this week, it was saying that an increasing number of Russian industries feel that they're in recession themselves, and it's beginning to hit out, as I've mentioned in the Q&A. Go and watch that. That is beginning to hit out at the local Russian people, with the Russian newspapers focusing on cucumber prices this week, a 425% increase. We had eggs a few weeks ago. Cucumbers are this week. We'll have to see what's next week. But it's getting the impact of the war in the heads and minds and the day-to-day lives of the average Russian person. That's what Putin fears most. So next interview is with another old friend of the show, Bill Browder, and what Bill doesn't know about the economic impact on Russia and Russian economics and Putin politically isn't worth knowing. Have a look at this here.
If he sits down with Zelenskyy and Trump, then it becomes obvious who the person is who doesn't want peace, and that's Vladimir Putin. Zelenskyy said, "I want peace. I'm ready for peace. Stop bombing us." Peace means you quit your invasion. And he's ready to negotiate on various terms, which are unbelievably generous to the Russians, just to stop the murder of his citizens. There are certain red lines. He doesn't want to give up territory that hasn't already been conquered by the Russians. I think that's reasonable. He wants security guarantees to say that if the Russians stop where they are, that they can't go on in the future. I think that's also reasonable. But if they were actually in a room and he were to say that's my condition, Putin would say, no, I want everything. And at that point, it becomes obvious that Putin is the guy holding back peace. And then Trump looks particularly bad if he doesn't do something to Putin, which he doesn't want to do. And so the easy way to avoid that is just not to go into that room and not to have that meeting.
As part of those comments that Lavrov said, he really did seem to voice an upset or even surprise with the US, alluding back to the Alaska talks that went on between Trump and Putin, and seemingly implying that America wasn't holding up its side of a deal made there. Do you think the Russians are getting quite frustrated that America haven't just given them everything they wanted, as they keep asking for?
Well, I mean, I think that if you look at the whole scenario, Russia has gotten a total free pass. There were so many different opportunities for Putin to agree a ceasefire, to stop his offensive, to come to the negotiating table, and at every single one of these opportunities, Putin has thumbed his nose at the process, at the Ukrainians, and most importantly, at the Americans. And so for them to be frustrated that there's been some small sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft, which, by the way, aren't being fully enforced, is really kind of disingenuous. But for what it's worth, it doesn't really matter what Lavrov says. I mean, Lavrov is not a principal here. He's said a few very anti-American things, and he was then for a while we didn't see him. He didn't fall out of any windows or succumb to any poison, but he kind of disappeared into the woodwork for a while, and then he comes out again and says something. And it could easily be good cop, bad cop. I don't know exactly what the strategy is here, but I can pretty much guarantee you that Putin is not going to start a new hostile situation with America, because he's gotten such a great deal so far that he should really be very pleased with himself. And whatever Lavrov says, he's either done unauthorized or he's doing it as just a counterpoint to the warm communications that Putin probably has privately with President Trump and with Steve Witkoff.
And it seems like the US and Russia could be on a bit of a collision course here. We've heard some angry language out of Lavrov for the US over the last couple of days, accusing America of what they call unfair sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft. He says he sees no bright future economically with Washington. Do you think that honeymoon period that we alluded to before with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner and elements of the Kremlin might be coming to an end?
No. I think that President Trump will ignore that. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner will ignore that. They'll carry on with their facade of a peace negotiation, and there will not be any harsher punishments on Russia than there already are.
And Starlink has banned Russian soldiers and troops in Ukraine from using its systems. That appears to have halted or slowed some Russian offensives that are going on in Ukraine. Were you surprised to see that move from Elon Musk? Because he's been very back and forth on Ukraine and his thoughts on supporting that country.
Well, I think that that's actually been one of the most positive things that's happened in the last few days, um, because that prevents Ukrainian deaths. And I don't know why Starlink allowed Russia to use their systems before. I'm glad that Elon Musk took this decision. It's impossible to know his thought process, but thank God they can't use it because it's completely screwed up their communications. It's made it very difficult for them to target Ukrainian positions, and less people have died as a result of that. And so, if there's been one good thing that's happened in the last few days, it's been that.
Bill goes on to talk about why Putin doesn't want to sit down with Zelenskyy and Trump, because Putin effectively is concerned that he will get called out. He will get found out by sitting in front of them. He doesn't want to turn around to Trump to his face and say no to what Zelenskyy is proposing. And if you look at all the peace negotiations so far, Zelenskyy has given so many concessions. He has moved on so many different issues, and Putin hasn't moved on one. In fact, Vladimir Putin has added additional requirements in. The biggest one that is said the whole way through is Putin wanting the areas of the Donbass that he hasn't captured yet. And he's trying to tie any negotiations into that. British Defence Intelligence has suggested it'll take at least another 4 years and 2 million casualties to capture that. This is the defensive belt that Ukraine has built, and if the Russians got through that, it would be a relatively straightforward ambition for them to militarily get to Kyiv again. So they can't afford to give up this defensive or this fortress belt that's there. And Bill explains that well. Don't just listen to the clip. Go and listen to the long-form interview with Scott and Bill. They're both good. And the other long-form interview that's worth listening to is our next one. And this is me sitting down with George Barros from the Institute of the Study of War. Have a listen to this here.
The Russian Telegram bloggers and military sources have for months, and in fact for years, but in this particular sector in Zaporizhzhia for months, have been lying about their performance. They've been embellishing their performance. They've been putting forward maps of the purported front line that are much further ahead of what ISW assesses, what other organizations assesses, what the available combat footage and visual evidence can suggest. And now what seems to be happening is we're having a retroactive Russian correction. And so the Russian maps at this stage have gotten about 15, 20 kilometers, give or take, ahead of reality. And now, to save face, the Russians are actually adjusting their assessment by retrograding their lines back. And what they're claiming is that there's a counterattack. The Ukrainians are attacking us. They penetrate our lines, that sort of thing. Here's what the new line is looking like. I'm sure you've seen that map with the red and the blue ink and that sort of thing. And what's very interesting is that if you actually compare the battlefield geometry of those new lines from the supposed Ukrainian counteroffensive, it actually lines up pretty closely with where the lines have more or less statically been for the past several weeks, actually. And so this seems to be more of how the Russians are deciding to solve their problem of having overconfidently stated what the front line is, and now they're correcting it.
Overconfidently is a good word, but there are financial incentives and medal incentives and other things for the Russian commanders to say that they're getting further ahead, which is why we see them running forward, putting a little flag up, taking a photograph, and geolocating it, sending it back. Surely with this sort of correction, there's going to be penalties that'll come in. Are we expecting some Russian commanders to take up window cleaning and fall out of 9th floor windows?
I think at this tactical level, probably not, because these sort of tactical blunders don't make it very high up the chain. I think these are sort of going to be like company, platoon, maybe regimental or brigade level issues at absolute highest. But this is tactical stuff. We're talking about 5 or tens of kilometers in rural fields that are not decisive for current operations, and neither the main Russian area of responsibility. The kinds of failures that do actually result with problems and generals getting demoted or falling out of windows and such are major operational failures. I mean, things like the loss of Kupiansk, the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv in 2022, or commanders who receive and build such a terrible reputation over a long protracted time. There have been, for example, regimental and brigade commanders who are become infamous for just simply sending droves and droves of men to their deaths, or really blundering quite badly tactical scenarios. There was a failed river crossing in Luhansk or Donetsk back in 2022, for example, in Belgorivka, where a battalion's worth of tanks and armored personnel carriers were destroyed in a botched river crossing. And so I think the commander who was in charge of that got into trouble because of that. So, but this sort of thing, I think they'll probably it'll be swept under the rug.
Well, yes, they didn't get Vladimir Putin to turn around and say it was a big success and all the rest of it, and then Zelenskyy go and get a photograph in front of some symbol that suggested that was wrong. But at the same time, we've got that was Russian telegram claims. We're getting the Ukrainian Minister of Defense are turning around and saying that the Russians are concentrating up to 100,000 troops. They're getting armored capability together. They are preparing for some form of large offensive, and we're assuming, come spring, come summer, a standard spring-summer offensive. We've seen this report come in every year so far, and yes, the Russians have tried something, but it's always petered out. What are you seeing? Are the Ukrainians, and why do you think the Ukrainians are once again banging that drum of the Russians are coming? Help!
Yeah, well, this is going to go close to the bounds of what we can see with open source. It's notoriously difficult to be able to track forces, especially once they're already in the theater and not using logistics like trains and stuff and such around. So my situational awareness of here is going to be slightly degraded, but the Ukrainians have better intelligence than what I have. And we know that the Ukrainians do track the Russian force groupings pretty well within Ukraine. There's, of course, allied American and NATO intelligence sharing with Ukraine. And so whenever they talked about these large force groupings, they've always been substantiated. I mean, it's because there are efforts, they do build operational reserves, they do prepare to commit forces. And I think what we're seeing now is the Russian preparations for the anticipated spring offensive. We are in a low tempo time. The tempo since January has been degraded because the weather's been poor. It's brutal cold, and of course, as you know, those Russian soldiers that do the infiltration missions, they're doing that with just the pack on their back and not a whole lot else, and so it's very hard to do that sort of war fighting. And I do anticipate that we will see an intensified push or series of pushes in the next several weeks or months, probably in March, certainly by April. I would expect us to see a new push. So they're preparing. It'll be interesting to see how the Russian command weights which sectors of the front are going to be the priority sectors, which ones are going to be more opportunistic. Our current assessment, based off of the arrayment of which formations are where and where the better units are, is that the Russians are going to continue prioritizing Donetsk Oblast, particularly the Konstantinovka fight, and perhaps even in Liman to try to get to the northern, the left bank of the Siversky Donetsk River, so they can attack the fortress belt from the northern direction as well. That seems to be the priority effort right now, but we're of course always collecting more data and always adjusting our assessments based off of where they put the best units.
And in this clip, this is George talking about the Zaporizhzhia front, and we've had a lot of reports of the Russians having some success in the Zaporizhzhia front, but the Ukrainians saying that, or the Russians saying that the Ukrainians have penetrated the front by 18 kilometers. George turns around and says, the Ukrainians haven't done that, or nothing that they've seen suggests they've done that. What this seems to be is the Russians had over-exaggerated how much territory they've taken, and they're now trying to roll back on that and say that the Ukrainians have counterattacked in and they've moved forward. This is an internal reporting reset in the Russian side of things, as George says. But we're going to discuss Ukrainian command and control in the long-form interview and various other very, very interesting subjects. What George and his team don't know about what's going on tactically on the ground on a day-to-day basis isn't worth knowing. And George has just got back from Ukraine, so his insights from that are fascinating. So go and watch the whole interview. But that's all I have from Recap this week. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, put your comments in for me to answer in the Q&A, and pass it around your friends as well. And please bear with us. We're on our own channel now. That's because you've made this such a success, and thank you for that. And thank you for listening. Goodbye.